still want to ask you a question about the MVC, do you?
Oh yeah. Because so the MVC part, design pattern, does it only apply to JavaFX or like? Because I've seen like it being used in JavaFX where like we have the graphic side, which is the XML file, and then we have controller and another class which are like the model and the controller as well. But I was thinking like in terms of the whole project, if I need to store some data somewhere, can I just create a static class? Because I know we are supposed to avoid static classes, but if the only purpose of this class would be to store data, and it would be really easy to access it then, because we don't.
Yes, I remember this question, yes. So the short answer is no. Don't use a static class or static data. Even if it's easier to implement. To say something, oh, it's easier to implement this way, is not a very good justification for doing it. The problem with static classes, static methods, static variables is that you can't control the pattern of communication in your projects. So if you have a project with 1,000 classes, all 1,000 classes can access this object in a totally unpredictable way. That's not good, because you might make a modification and break 1,000 other classes, if you know what I mean. So it's not a good design principle. Yeah. So that's does that answer the question? I know it's not the answer.
Class variables. So class variables are all the like variables that are inside the class, but not inside the method, like the ones that are before the functions.
Yes, those should not be static either. I wish I could go back in time and do a special lecture just on this topic. These are what I would call beginner level mistakes, is to declare variables as static, or make a class static, or make methods static. And I call them beginner level mistakes because beginners don't know how to avoid this. They try to access a member variable and they get an error message that says this member variable can only be accessed in a static context, for example. And they don't realize what the ramifications of this error message are, because we haven't explained it well enough. Maybe, so that's why I thought, I wish I could go back in time and do a special lecture on how to avoid this systematic error, because it is a beginner level error that I see over and over and over again, and it's an error that I've made myself. I'm not excluding myself from that category. Does that make sense? Hopefully. Okay, today is very experimental. I've never done anything like this before, and it's very unusual. Usually you don't have academics with experience in industry telling stories. That's very, very unusual. In fact, I've never seen it before, ever in computer science. And I think it's mostly probably because academics are good at hiding from industry. So I've had a few jobs and I've had some interesting experiences, and I thought it would just be fun to tell you about some of the crazy, unusual experiences, just for fun, really. And it has absolutely nothing to do with Curiosity software. I have kind of 3 stories, and they go from, well, I have more than 3, but I was only going to tell 3 today. They go from like believable to unbelievable to no way, that didn't really happen. And like you might not believe everything, and I might not believe it either if I wasn't there experiencing it myself. I thought a fun starting point though would be to talk about the previous company I worked for as a full-time software developer. I worked for a company called AVL. They're a multinational company. They have offices in Austria, Germany, the US, and probably some other countries that I don't know about. And they developed automotive testing software, actually. Optimization and testing hardware and software. They're mostly focused on hardware. So for example, if you're Toyota and you want to optimize your cooling jackets to make sure it's doing the best job possible of transferring heat away from the engine block, you could bring it to AVL and say, look, here's our cooling jackets. Can you give us some recommendations about how to optimize this cooling jacket? That's their basic functionality, their basic job. And they do a lot of their design and optimization in software, and that's where I worked. I worked in the software development department. It's called the Advanced Simulation Technologies. I thought a fun exercise would be just to go through the coding conventions and try to remember, okay, which of the conventions did they violate? And what are the consequences of violating the conventions? Just as a fun, short exercise. So the first one about method length. This one is the first one. The first convention is about method length. That means that is a very important convention because it's number one. Like if I could only have one rule, that would be the one I would have, right? It wouldn't be enough. Did AVL follow this convention? Well, they didn't have coding conventions. So no, they didn't follow this rule, right? And what happens when you don't follow this rule? They had a method in their software that was several thousand lines long. I think it was about 5,000 lines long at one point. And the consequence, there's a kind of phenomena that happens. When a method gets too long, at some point it becomes untouchable. It can no longer be modified because nobody can understand what the consequences of modifying that method are. I don't know exactly what the length of that is. It might be 500 or 1,000 lines, but at some point it becomes so long that nobody is willing to touch it because they don't want to be held responsible for any of the consequences of touching that method. So it will get checked out, and it will get checked back in with a certain length, and it will never get touched again, ever. Right? That's called legacy code. And AVL had lots and lots of legacy code. Actually, most of the code in existence in industry is legacy code. It fits in that category. Has anybody seen this one? Like, has anybody ever seen a method with more than 5 levels of indentation? It's very easy to write a method with 6 or 7 or 8, well, not a working method, not a method that you can understand. But at some point, if your methods have too many levels of indentation, they are no longer understandable. They just can't be understood by anybody. And of course, if you write a method with, say, 7 or 8 levels of indentation, the chances are the method is long, too. It's probably violating rule number 1. And it turns into legacy code again. Somebody checks it in, they test it for a while, they check it in, and then it becomes untouchable. Nobody wants to touch that anymore because they're afraid it will break and they will be held responsible, right? Because when you check in, you're using version control, and you check in that method, your name appears. Like the last person to check this in was Bob on this date, right? And you don't want to be that person who checked it in last. No line of code shall exceed 80 characters. I can say that this rule was very rarely violated at AVL. They kept to this rule pretty well, actually, so that was very unusual to see. All class variables start with the two-letter character sequence M underscore. They didn't follow this rule because they had no rules. And I remember the first time I saw this rule when I was a master's student. Where did I first see this rule? I was taught software development and object-oriented methodology from my master's thesis supervisor, and he had a PhD in software engineering from Brown University in the US. So he was the first one that introduced me to this rule, and I didn't like it. I saw that rule and I was like, and I had the same reaction as a lot of people in the audience. They just didn't like that, adding the string length to the variable names. But I can say if you're working in industry and you're trying to understand someone else's source code, it does turn out to be very useful to be able to see the name of a variable and without having to look up anywhere or anything, knowing whether it's a local variable or a class variable. It's very useful, and it makes things faster and easier. All class variables are accessed through accessor methods. So yeah, this rule was never followed in AVL. And one of the qualities of their software, at least the product I was working on, is that it was incredibly unstable. It was one of the users made a comment that it was the most unstable piece of software that they had ever seen before or ever used before. So they didn't use accessor methods. The software crashed left, right, and center. And they never performed error checking. Right? Setters are all about performing error checking to make sure your object is in a valid state at all times. If you can conform to that simple rule, then you'll have really stable and robust software. By the way, feel free to ask questions or make comments anytime.
So even inside other faction, the object, in the class, do we still have to use getters and setters to access the variable, or can we just?
I would recommend you still use getters and setters inside your own class, inside their own class. I know it sounds unusual, and I guess it is unusual, but I do it, and I recommend that other people do it as well. If you want to make really robust, bug-free, error-free code, you would use that rule. And I do talk about it in the debugging lecture. And it's because where do programs crash? They crash on assignment statements. That's not the only place they crash, but if they do crash, there's a good chance that an assignment statement is involved. And the setters do some error checking on all the assignment statements. So you move all of your assignment statements to the set methods. All of your set methods do error checking. And so you're always checking to make sure your objects are in a valid state. Yeah. Okay, and then the accessor methods come at the top of both header files and implementation files. That's a C++ rule, by the way. C++ splits their classes up into two files. Question?
Oh, okay. I was going to ask about the 5, because sometimes I want to have like a class variable, but it's going to be only used internally within the class itself.
Yes.
So I'm not going to get it, I'm not going to set it. Is that okay?
You never get it and you never set it?
It's mainly like some sort of variable I want to like have the class hold on to so I can use later in like other methods, so I don't have to like pass like 5 parameters to it every single time.
Yes.
Is that okay?
I would still use getters and setters in this case. Yeah. I still would.
I guess I could show you the code I have here later. I don't know.
Yeah, you can show me the code. I think in the lab would be a good
yeah.
time.
Okay. Thank you very much.
So I had you know, my software developer friends at AVL used to make fun of me a lot for having all these rules, because I used all of these rules when I wrote my own software in industry. However, I could say that my software didn't crash. I was the only one that could say that. I said, yeah, you can make fun of me, it's fine, I don't mind. But I'm the only one that knows how to write software or that follows rules, and the software doesn't crash. And I said, go ahead and try to crash my software. Go ahead and give it a try. It won't happen. Okay, all member variables, class variables are private, that's fine. Private methods begin with a lowercase. Okay, that does not apply in Java. And so private methods begin with a lowercase letter, whereas public methods begin with an uppercase letter. AVL did follow this rule. They did. They had that rule and they followed it, which was very good. In general, methods should not take more than 5 parameters. We kind of had a special lecture on that already, right? Everybody remembers that. And don't use magic numbers, use symbolic constants. I know that everybody loves this rule. This is the rule that gets violated the most, by the way, out of all of them, magic numbers. Everybody loves to use magic numbers, and there were lots of magic numbers at AVL. But every single software coding book you ever pick up in your life will say, do not use magic numbers. They all say it. And there are lots of reasons for that. I remember when I was a student, a master's student, I was trying to use some source code from a PhD student. We were studying at the same time, both doing visualization. And it was my master's thesis supervisor that recommended, oh, why don't you just get Phil's code and work with that and see if you can use that for one aspect of the project. And there was a magic number in there, right? Undocumented magic number, but it turned out to be really important. I think I remember what the number was, and I know what it means now, actually. I think it was 255, and I think I know what it means. Anyways, it was a magic number. I had no idea what it meant at the time. And so I said, well, Phil is still around. Why don't I give Phil a call and see if he can tell me what this number is? And then he came and looked at it. He was staring at it. And he just said, I don't know what it means. I've forgotten. I wrote that 2 years ago, and I have no idea what it means anymore. So that's one reason magic numbers are bad. They're illegible to other people. Other developers won't necessarily know what those numbers are, no matter how obvious you think they are. Even you won't understand your magic numbers if enough time passes between the time you typed it and the time you need to read it again. Those are 2 reasons. A third reason is sometimes you might think, oh, well, copy and replace, like edit replace will work. If I need to change the value of this number, like 5, all I have to do is like Control F, copy, paste, and replace or whatever. That's not true either, though. Because 5 in one method and 5 in a different method might mean 2 different things. One might be referring to 5 people, and one might be referring to 5 elephants or something. Like those 2 5s are not necessarily connected to each other and represent the same thing. So it's another reason why magic numbers are a bad idea. You can't just copy and replace them or search and replace. You can't do that when you want to update a magic number, because a 6 in one method and a 6 in another class might be completely different 6s, if you know what I mean, and represent completely different things. Okay, that was not the most exciting stuff. But those are the rules that AVL violated the magic numbers rule. When I started working there, I had some experience already, and I remember seeing the source code for the first time, and I remember looking at it and noticing that there were no conventions, no coding conventions. You can see that when you look at source code written by other people. They were also violating a lot of the object-oriented design guidelines. So if you inherit a project, if you see a project and you see that classes are not nouns, some of their classes were verbs, right? If you see that principle being violated, you're on a failing project, actually. If you see that you're on a project that has no coding conventions and they're violating, like objects are not necessarily nouns, methods are not necessarily verbs, the inheritance principles are not being followed correctly, you're on a failing project, actually. I knew within a few days I was on a failing project. And what is a failing project? It's a project that's losing money. I knew it like after a few days. I could see no coding conventions, basic design principles being violated. I knew I was on a failing project. Why that project kept getting funding is a different question, but I didn't have to worry about that too much. So I arrived at AVL, and they did not have a machine for me set up yet, right? And by the way, I had flown from the US to Austria to start at this company. So it wasn't like down the street or anything. It took a lot of investment on my part to work there. Anyways, they said, oh, we'll just give you a temporary machine. That's fine, until the new one arrives. I said, yeah, that sounds reasonable. In the meantime, you can just study the code, familiarize yourself with the code base while your new machine arrives. And that's when I was looking at the code, discovering, oh, there are no coding conventions being followed, and a lot of object-oriented design principles not being followed. Anyways, a few days pass, and next to my office in the landing area, 4 very, very large boxes appear. Very large, like, this big kind of thing. And I'm just thinking, oh, maybe the new computers are here. But I'll just be patient. And I was brand new, right? Brand new at the company. I didn't know anybody. Brand new in the country. I didn't know anybody. Like, I was a mouse for the first month, basically. But I saw the boxes there, and I thought, oh, hopefully one of those is my new machine. That would be nice. And the temporary machine they gave me was very, very slow. It was a really old and very slow and very painful to work with machine. And I knew, like, okay, I shouldn't invest too much into this machine because I'm going to get a new one anyways. So anything I install here, I have to reinstall it on the new machine. Any work that I do here, I'll have to redo on the new machine. So I didn't want to invest too much effort into the old machine. Anyways, a week passes, and the boxes are still sitting there on the floor. There were 4 of them, actually. And I was like, okay, maybe they're not the new machines. Like, maybe one of those boxes is not my new machine. I don't know, because it's been a week has passed, and those boxes haven't moved. And then 2 weeks passes, and the boxes are still sitting there. And I'm like, wow, those are not, I was starting to think like, okay, that must not be my new machine, because the boxes are just sitting there for weeks. So I waited for about a month. I waited maybe 2 weeks or something, and I would ask my manager. I had 4 managers. I would ask one of them, like, do you have any information about the new machine? Is that like on its way? Is it coming? You know, he'd be like, yeah, it's on its way. You know, we've ordered that new machine. It's on its way. So no problem. Just be patient. So I said, okay, I'll just be patient. You know, what could be wrong? And finally, a month passes. A month. And the boxes are still sitting on the floor. And then I asked my manager, I said, is that not, like, what's in those boxes? Is my new machine in that one of those boxes? And he said, oh, well, let me go find out. And it turned out my new machine was one of those boxes. So that's kind of the first. I think that story is believable, but it's very surprising. And it doesn't have that much to do with software engineering, actually. But it's kind of a strange experience that I had at one of my previous jobs. I started with the same time as another software developer, so there were 2 new machines, and they were both for us to start using. And they had sat there for 1 month before they opened them and gave them and set them up for the developers. Good story, bad story, entertaining, thumbs up, thumbs down. That's believable, right? Like, you can believe that happened, right? Okay, story number 2 is a little bit unbelievable. It's not necessarily about software engineering, actually. I worked for a company called Private Healthcare Systems. Let's see if they still exist. I think they don't exist anymore. This was back in the US. I think they don't exist anymore. I think they were bought by another company or they went out of business, PHCS. It looks like they might have got bought by this other one. Anyways, I worked for a company called Private Healthcare Systems. You won't find these companies on my CV, by the way. And as you know, healthcare is complicated, right? There's that healthcare word, private healthcare systems. You won't see that healthcare is complicated, right? I don't know of a country that has solved the healthcare problem, right? Yes, England has a great healthcare system, but you would never say, oh, we've solved the healthcare problem. Well, this healthcare company was located in the US, and healthcare is an even more unsolved problem in the US. Probably you've all heard stories about healthcare in the US, different kinds of stories. I worked for a healthcare business called Private Healthcare Systems. This was when I was a student, undergrad student. I was working there as a summer intern. And I was not a competent developer, not at all. Not a competent programmer as an undergraduate, not at all. Partially because my bachelor's degree is in physics. They were working on some software, right? And the software was trying to make recommendations about healthcare costs, the costs of healthcare. For example, how much should open heart surgery cost? How much should a bypass surgery cost? Or how much should fixing a broken leg cost? How much, I don't know, any healthcare procedure in a hospital, they were trying to generate average and target costs for any procedure that you would undertake in a hospital. How much should an x-ray cost? Like, how much should, whatever procedure you can think of, if you need a new head or something, how much should that cost? So they were in the business of trying to figure out a target cost for every procedure in a hospital. And they would set up something called a medical cost database, right, for every procedure. So a hospital could perform some procedure, they would generate a cost, and then it would be compared with the costs generated by private healthcare systems to see if they went like over the average or under the average. And if they went under the average, they got bonus. They got like, oh, you performed that procedure very efficiently, very cost efficiently. If it compared well with the cost target of private healthcare systems, then that hospital got a bonus. That was their business, to try to figure out how much should these procedures cost. It's just a little background about the company. Very, very funny company to work for. Anyways, I was an undergraduate. I was just there as a summer intern. I was not a competent software developer or programmer at all. So what was my job? My job was documentation. Lots of people have jobs just doing software documentation, and I had 2 of those jobs. So what did that mean? That meant they had a lot of software that wasn't documented. Right? They had just source code, but they had no Java docs, no explanation as to how the software worked or anything like that. No documentation. Some of it, they literally had no documentation at all. They had the software was responsible for generating those target costs. There was a piece of software. You gave it the right input, and at the output was a cost at the end. And there was a piece of software called GenTarget that generated the target cost for any procedure. But that software was 100% undocumented. So the original developer who wrote it quit the company and left behind the most critical piece of software that the company, the whole department hinged on, the whole company. And it was completely undocumented, and nobody knew how it worked. Nobody. They just knew that there was this piece of software called GenTargets. The developer left, and he took all the knowledge of how it worked with him, and it was 100% undocumented. So my job was to document that piece of software, to produce a document that says how that piece of software works, the logic. How is this software generating these cost targets for all the procedures? It was like a magic puzzle. And how was I going to do that? Because I couldn't read the source code. I was not fluent in the programming language they were using. What I was supposed to do was to interview the developers working on the software. So my manager at the time said, okay, Bob, I want you to go interview a guy named Paul and ask them, you're going to sit down with your pen and paper and ask them how GenTargets works, that the processing logic for GenTargets that everybody wanted to know about. Oh, it was really funny. In hindsight, it was funny. At the time, I didn't think it was that funny. So I said, okay, I can do this. Like, can't be that bad. And Paul was a Everybody knows what a consultant is. So the consultant is a person that's hired on an hourly basis. They're not an actual employee of the company. They're just hired on an hourly basis to get specific jobs done. They work a certain number of hours and they get paid by the hour. But consultants are very expensive typically. He was getting paid something like $100 an hour, something like that. So I contacted Paul and I said, I'd like to set up an interview with you or a meeting with you so we can sit down and talk about GenTargets and try to document how it works so that the rest of the company can understand how it works. And he said, okay. So I went down to his office. I remember this very well. I went down to his office and I had, I was a good student. I had a notepad and a pen all ready. And I brought something else with me too. I thought, oh wow, I'm meeting with a consultant, a developer, and I know he costs something like $100 an hour. So I don't want to miss anything that he says. So I brought a little handheld recorder too, so I wouldn't miss anything. So I sat down and I said, okay, I had my recorder and I put it on the desk. And I sat there I said, okay, can we start documenting what Gen Targets does? And it was so funny. I should do a reenactment. Maybe I should do a reenactment. There's a chair over there. This is so unbelievable. He was in a rotating chair, by the way. This is not a rotating chair. But just imagine it is a rotating chair. He did this, I'm sitting here. He did this. He said, this is all wrong. We cannot document the software, this is wrong. The only documentation that should exist for this software should be integrated with the source code, like Java Docs is, by the way. He said, we cannot document the code in a separate document. This is all wrong, we can't do this. And he literally turned in his chair and did this with his posture, and I couldn't, it's a very strange posture. And that's not the answer I was expecting. I was just this undergrad intern, right? And I was like, wow, this is not what I was expecting to happen. And so I just said, are you sure? Or something like that. I have no idea what I said. I just said, are you sure, maybe? And he said, yes, we can't do this. And I was like, okay, nothing I can do about it. And I was like, at least I have this on a recording, so I can tell the manager. The manager wouldn't believe me if I told her that this happened. Anyways, I said, okay, and I just get up, I grab my recorder, and I leave. And then I go to my manager, and I said, you're not going to believe what happened, but I tried to sit down with Paul and document Gen Targets. And she said, yeah, okay, good. What happened? And then I told her what happened, hoping that she would believe me, but I didn't have to worry because I had the recording of the conversation on my little dictaphone. Anyways, he got fired. That's it. So he got fired, and that's the end. But it's a weird story, isn't it? It's very strange. You would never expect anything like that to happen in anywhere. Is it believable? Does everybody believe that actually happened? It's hard to believe, but it really did happen. Unfortunately, I don't have the recording. Imagine if I still had the recording and I could play it. That would be unbelievable. Okay, I saved the last one, the best one, for last. This is absolutely unbelievable and absolutely legendary. This was for a company that doesn't exist anymore. Cambridge Interactive does not exist. I think there's absolutely no trace of this company anymore, no digital trace of this company. They were located in Boston, not the Cambridge here, the Cambridge in Boston. Same with private healthcare systems, that was in the US, Massachusetts. Cambridge Interactive was an internet startup company, and they were trying to develop a search engine that they could charge customers to use. So instead of a free search engine, they were trying to develop a licensed search engine. And this was before Google, right? This was a kind of novel idea, not really, but it was somewhat novel at that time. I didn't think it was a good idea. I thought, why would anybody pay for a search engine when there are free ones? I didn't get it. Anyways, they went out of business quickly. I was there. It was the same kind of situation. I was still an undergrad doing a summer internship and trying to get my foot in the door, let's say, into a step on the career ladder to eventually become a software developer or some affiliated with that industry. And they gave me the job of documentation again. I was documenting the logic of the search engine. That was my job again, because it was undocumented, right? The original developer, you'll see this in Bob's coding conventions, by the way, in the part 2, if anybody's ever looked at part 2. The original software developer left, right? He left the code, he left, and he didn't document the code, right? And so they were trying to do this retroactive documentation again. Absolute disaster, by the way. If you're working for a company trying to do that, you're working on a failing project. All 3 of these are failing projects, by the way. Anyways, I had a friend. It was a startup company with only like 20 to 25 employees, so similar to Curiosity, very small, but not as, the lifespan was much shorter. I had a friend at the company, his name was Matt. They gave me a kind of side project which was to develop an online library, because the company was buying books, but nobody knew which books the company had because they were scattered all over the place. Different people had different books, in their cubicles. So they said, well, why don't we develop a little internal online library, so if somebody's looking for a book, they can use this web application to find out who has the book, right? If we have the book and who has it, for example. So there's a little web interface that serves as an online internal library. So they said, why don't you give that a try, Bob? Give it a try as a side project. And I had a friend, Matt, who was an administrator at the company. And he heard about this project and he said, I want to do this project. I want this, because it was a startup. Like, it was the Wild West. It wasn't formal. Like, anybody could work on almost anything they wanted. And I didn't know what I was doing. So I said, okay, well, I'm a little bit annoyed that Matt is taking this project, but I can't say I'm an authority on this and that I'll do some much better job than Matt. Matt wanted that job. So we had these weekly meetings with the whole company every Friday at about lunchtime. Weekly meetings. So all 20 employees would get together in a space about this big and give a little 60-second update on their progress. Whatever it was they were working on, they would give a 60-second update on their progress. And every Friday it would come to Matt and they would say, how's the digital library coming? And Matt would always give an answer, oh, it's coming along really well. Should be ready in 2 weeks. And be like, oh, really? Okay, great. And every week, okay, how's the digital library coming along? Matt would say, oh, it's coming on great. It'll be ready in 1 week. Then 1 week, another week passes. It comes time to Matt again. How's it going? Oh, there's a little problem, but it's no problem. It's not a real problem. I'm going to have it solved. This thing will be up and running in a few days. And there was a meeting where he said, it's almost finished. It'll be up in a few hours. And then another week passes, and they say, you said last week it's going to be ready in a few hours. Oh, that was such a character. And he said, you want to see it? You want to see it? It's ready. And everybody's like, really? It's ready? Like, the digital library is ready to go? And he's like, yep, let's go. I'm going to give you a demo right now. And everybody's all excited, like, wow, somebody finished a project. And it was Matt, and nobody was expecting him to finish it. So he said, okay, everybody, let's go. And then we all go into a room with a PC on a desk, like this one, and he's like, everybody ready for the demo? And they're like, yeah, let's do this. And everybody was in shock. Like, he went over to the PC, right? He typed in the address. It was in a web browser. He said, here's the digital library. So he was standing like, he was sitting, you know, giving the demo like this. And then everybody else in the company was, you know, like this, watching the demo, you know, standing in a semicircle. And he's like, okay, this is what the web interface looks like, right? And now you can click on this button and do a search. So he clicked on search, and it brought up the search window. And he said, now you can search for a book. He typed in a book, boom, like find this book. It goes to the next page, it brings up the book. And he's like, now I can check out the book. You know, and like, so if I want to check it out and tell everybody I have it, watch this, I'll hit the checkout button, it goes to the checkout page, and then he checks out a book. And he's like, watch, I'll check it in too. He checks it back in to the library, and then bam, it's checked in. And he's like, voila, right? And everybody starts clapping. They're like, wow, great job, like it's finished, or at least some version of it is finished. And I was also watching, and I was like, wow, like this is amazing, because nobody knew it was going to happen. Nobody thought it was going to happen, because Matt was always telling these kind of elusive progress updates, and everybody was starting to get suspicious that maybe this thing is never going to happen. But we all applauded, right? Can you see where this is going? And left the room. And I was really impressed. I was like, wow, he got it done. Like, what a great job. And then he says, and then he comes up to me and whispers, Bob, did you notice anything? And I said, no, I didn't notice anything. He said, I just demonstrated the mock-up of the program. It's not working at all, like nothing is working. It's just a mock-up of the program. And nobody noticed. Everybody gave a standing ovation. And I was like, are you serious? He's like, yeah. And that was it. That was it. That's the end of the story. It was amazing. Absolutely amazing. Hard to believe though, isn't it? So those are some of my experiences in the industry, some unusual ones. Okay, we'll resume on Thursday. There is a lab on Thursday, and it's just for the courseworks. Did anybody like the stories from industry? Experimental rant over. Okay, you're all free. You're all free. Unless there are any questions.